But not Dobermans.
Yeah.
Well, the thing was, it was this bag, and because it was swinging, I think it thought it was an animal, and so it kind of came along and it tapped the bag, and I threw the bag away, and it's fine.
You're still carrying the bag. I'll get rid of that bag.
Huh?
I said you're still carrying the bag.
Oh yeah, I love this bag, but
yeah.
So not a lot of
Temporary.
horrific,
I think it thought it was an animal,
a
so
lot
which
of
is
horrific
understandable.
associations that I'll go with them.
Oh.
Is nature quite a big theme in poetry? Because you've written around a seal and a dog, and then I suppose the religion and science aspects of it.
Yeah, I think kind of well, yeah, nature is a big part of my poetry, I suppose, but so is the city. So I explore them both, I think, in my poetry. But I suppose just personally, as I'm sure we all are concerned about the environment. So I think that those concerns kind of feed into my work a lot because I'm worried about them. So I have to do something with that.
Do you juxtapose them?
Yeah, I suppose so. In certain poems, I do.
What is your current thinking on religion versus science? If you can summarize it in like a sentence.
Don't answer the question.
I think maybe to get away from that question, but maybe just the place that religion has, I suppose, in my poetry. I think I'm interested in religion, and I think I kind of have perhaps a religious instinct, so that gets kind of acted out in my poetry as well. But
Instead of looking at a cycle, is that completed? I'm sorry.
oh yes,
Is
so
it half of it, or it is, or-
it's part of the second and third poem I read. They're part of a kind of a cycle of poems where there's they're told in voices, so the voices belong to the inhabitants of this new land, and it's kind of exploring their emotions about moving there, and then their disappointment at kind of finding out that actually it's just a piece of abandoned land.
Going back to before, you don't really know when something is finished or when it started. Did you aim to have a cycle, or did it kind of move on quite naturally, or?
I think it was something I realised that I couldn't just explore it simply in one poem alone, that it had to be part of a bigger construction. So it just felt instinctively right that it would be more than one poem. So then the next poem came, the next poem came. So
And it stopped when? Around the circles
I
again.
suppose it stopped when I had explored the voices I wanted to explore.
This question isn't just for you, it's a poet question in general. How do you regard structure? I don't know, because I'm not saying that it doesn't sound like your poems didn't have any structure, but whenever I read any poetry, I often find it difficult to work out if there is, like, because obviously as a composer, structure is quite important. So I think you have to wonder whether the poems are through composed, so like, do you kind of just write it, or do you just kind of sit down and just draw, this is the A section, this is the piece, whatever, I don't know. How does it work?
Well, I suppose for me, what I'm trying to convey will find its form. So I suppose it's different. I imagine for all poets, but I begin with that kind of emotional kind of element, and then that whatever I want to express finds its form. So sometimes that can be in a more kind of abstract way, and if it's more traditional, then I will kind of go back to more conventional modes of structure in my poetry.
Does anyone else want to comment on that question?
Yeah, what's a conventional mode of structure in
I
poetry?
think maybe more of a kind of classical, like less experimental form.
I think typology becomes a new medium. I think anyone that has really followed poetry, in its most kind of interesting developments in the last kind of 100 years or so, will see that not only is the sound something to play with, as well as the actual content, but also the typography and the pagination. How you visibly create the poem and lay it out on the page often has nothing to do with how it's read, but has to do with the shape or a presentation that you want someone to get to. So I think often, of course, in very traditional kind of structured poetry, there'll be rhyming couplets and so forth, and sonnets, where the form is actually constructed. But I think, for me, and I think for a vast majority of kind of lucid, fluid contemporary poetry, the rhythm of the reading is almost second to the actual. The most extreme example would be a calligram, where you would draw a piece of art using words. So Apollinaire drew a horse by writing Chabot over and over and over again, beautifully. So it looks like a piece of art. And that's a beautiful piece of poetry. It's visual as well as using language. And so that comes into it as well, I think, in contemporary poetry.
Yeah, 'cause I mean, it's kind of, in music very often, like, there's always a structure, some description, but like, it's often very difficult to hear it or even see it in the score. I mean, like, it's mathematics is often coming to play with just like composers using string theory and things like that. So like, and it's like, you know, but I think it gives the piece an overall coherence to the listener, even if they couldn't tell you exactly what that is.
It probably does exist in a lot of poetry, but certainly there's no hard and fast rule. I think, especially the domination of kind of American 20th century poetics, it's fluid, it is colloquial, it is as read, and certainly that's how I write. I want the words to be arranged in a certain way, I don't know why, so that they hit you when you see it as a piece of, piece of language.
Even going back to your performance, it was very much a performance. I'd just be curious to hear what are your current thoughts on the thought of someone else performing your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a huge thing the other day when we had these discussions. I'm fascinated by this idea, I really am, because I think it was said to me when I asked the singers, yourself included, what do you look for? You know, what would you see? Do you understand the text? Because you don't need to. I mean, you can say that you want to, but you don't need to, especially if it's in German. So I think to a certain extent that fascinates me, because then someone said, oh, I'm sure you speak German. I'm sure you speak German. But you know what I mean?
No, isn't that? That's more like you do need to. You really do.
But your voice produces a sound, you don't have to. You
But
just
if
need
you
to
don't
produce
know
that
what
sound.
it's saying, what the word's saying, you can't produce. You could be singing about death and be singing it very happily.
But what if someone says this is about death, sing it, and then you'd be like, this bit's about death, and this, you don't literally need to know the word meaning. I'm not trying to take away.
No.
Of course, I understand that you would. And every singer I spoke to was like, of course you do, you read it, you get hold of it before you, etc. But from my point of view, you don't need to, just as you don't need to with yeah, and I think, so then someone said to me, well, ignore that fact with the singer, just write your poem. Well, I can't pretend that now.
It's quite interesting.
I can't bracket that out.
I think you need to know, at least you need to know what you want to say with each phrase, because whether or not you know the exact nuances of German grammar, it's important to have an interpretation. So to say like, is this upward phrase? Is that is that a climax of some sort? Is that where am I moving? What am I trying to? Even if it's not something which is, you don't necessarily have to know the exact sort of nuances of meaning, but you need to know what you're trying to say with it. Otherwise, you can't give it any expression. Otherwise, it's just sort of flat.
It's the same when it comes to setting poetry to music, because if you don't understand it, and I say if you get one of your poems, for example, and like the one that you wrote, which was all vowels, which was kind of syllables. Like if I, say if I read that, and then I said it's some sort of quasi-Mozartian aria.
That's the thing. I really embrace that. I mean, I want mistakes. I don't want things to be clean. What's written on the page and what I did are not recognisable with each other. I just freaked it out a little bit. I embrace the freakiness of the reading. So I think to a certain extent, that is a huge difference. I'm deliberately cultivating error and trying to cultivate all those kind of elements that get away from kind of classical boundaries. That's why I'm very excited about this, because there seems to be a bit of attention in that, and I like that, because you can't sing a poem wrong if my poem is deliberately trying to cultivate error. You can only do it your way. And in the same way that, to answer the question, going back to that process, I know that the singers are going to read the text, and that's going to influence the way they're going to perform it, and therefore that's going to inform what I write. And that has to be the case. So it's a completely different question of, so if we hire an actor, which I hate that, actors reading poetry, it kills me. I really do. I don't think that's ever right. There's something just wrong about that, I think.
What's the difference? Sorry.
It's fine.
What's the difference
It's-
between an actor reading it and our interpretation singing it?
You're singing.
Yeah, you're singing.
But-
You are performing. There's a musicality. There's obviously what you do. There's skill set. That's what I was saying about the other day. And also my problem with actors is more philosophical rather than practical. I find that a bit
I
repugnant.
just want to ask Richard, you wanted to say something. Hello, I'm sorry to be late. I'm Richard Baker. I wasn't here on Saturday, but Julian Phillips, who is Julian Phillips and I share the role of head of composition and composer mentors for this project. I just wanted to say that, in fact, you just touched on one of the key issues, which is about the relationship between kind of interpretation, as singers would understand it, and the reading of poetic text, and then what composers do with those texts. And this is something I'm particularly interested in, kind of from a research angle as well, because of course there's a great tradition of 20th century and 21st century pieces for voice that where the notion of an interpretation becomes it's an extremely elusive idea. I think of the Ligeti, Aventure, Nouvelle Aventure pieces, is there content there to be communicated? But in the absence of content, nevertheless, as a singer or as an interpreter, you have to make some decisions about how you perform. So that the relationship between performance and interpretation is something that I'd really like to keep coming back to, because I think it's sort of in that space is in a sense a lot of the things that we're going to be thinking about.
Shall we move on to our next poet?